When this title was announced, speculation was rampant, but now that TMNT The Last Ronin has finished, did it accomplish its goal? Or was it just a victim of hype? Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Kevin Eastman, Peter Laird and Tom Waltz, with art from Eastman, Esau and Isaac Escorza. The first issue of TMNT The Last Ronin was published by IDW Comics in October of 2020, with the fifth and final issue being released in April of 2022. Yep, they really took that long. And it's been 16 years since the Ninja Turtles were killed. With only one surviving member carrying both the weapons and the knowledge of his fallen brothers, he will embark on avenging them. But with time having passed and the city being ruled by the descendant of his arch enemy, can this last Ronin restore honour to his family? Or is it just too tall of a task for a lone turtle? Looking at the art now, and the first issue really had that wow factor. Jumping into this book really reminded me of the beginning of the Batman because it has a clear style that it's going for. Dark, futuristic and grimy, but unfortunately in a lot of ways similar to me, it just doesn't last. I'm genuinely baffled how there's so many different stylistic changes in just a 5-issue miniseries. But we'll get into that, and like I said, I did really enjoy these opening pages. It was so reminiscent of the original Ninja Turtles run, and it felt like a natural continuation of that, and that was exactly what I wanted. I knew that this was a concept that Eastman and Laird had wrote up back in the 80s when they were first working on the series, so why not honour that for a bit longer with the style that started it all off? And it did go one step further in regards to that when it came to the flashbacks. They were scattered throughout the series, and at first it was a nice surprise, but then it just became more like a breath of fresh air. Because at first glance they're a bit too messy, especially when you are coming from the modern day stuff that is a little bit cleaner even if the city is just completely dirty. And because it was so messy, I couldn't just gloss over these panels and get the gist of it like I'm sometimes susceptible to do, because as you might already know, I'm a bit of a dumb reader. So the contrast between the two worked really well, and it was like we were seeing the memory of somebody that's not as clear on the events as they were back then. However, it doesn't just stop at those two styles, and this is where the problems really came in for me. There were flashbacks in the middle that were more of a pastel look, but more in line with the stuff that was going on in the future. But it got a bit confusing because those flashbacks were actually happening before the ones that took on Eastman and Laird's style. Now I get the feeling that those black and white Eastman and Laird pages might have actually been some of the ones that they did back in the 80s. So it is great to see them, but at the same time it doesn't really make sense with this timeline, because a more modern style is actually shown before those flashbacks take place. As well, the longer that this book went on and those styles were being incorporated, something about the futuristic stuff just looked a little bit too computer generated. And I've thought about this for a while, but I can't put my finger on what causes this. And it's a shame because I preferred all the flashback styles and the art that we saw in the first issue more than the stuff that we got at the end. And that did actually affect the tone of the overall story. It looked a little bit too clean the longer that the book went on, and I just wish it would have kept the tone that it had in those opening pages. And then again, I'm criticising this, but with how long it took to release each issue, it could just be the case that each artist just developed naturally in that time. Because it wasn't just the tone that was affected, I feel like a book lost a part of its identity. Sure, it was more detailed and less blocky, but it kind of just looked like any other book that's coming out today. This was something that was supposed to be monumental, that's been in the works for nearly 40 years, and Eastman and Laird had such a unique and abstract style that's so unique to this comic franchise. So why not just keep that? I did like a lot of the design work though. The Last Ronin just looks phenomenal, and I'm really tempted to get that NECA Ultimate figure that they've done, and having this set in a more technologically advanced world really played to its advantage. Because it's only the city that's moved on, the sewers haven't developed, which meant that every time that the Ronin was in the city, he looked out of place. The energy in the action was also great, and if there's one thing that you probably want to get right in a Ninja Turtles story, it's going to be that. In particular, the one-on-one battles were the best. There were a few group fights in this, and I just don't feel like it impressed me as much for some reason. I just felt like it looked a lot flatter in those scenes where there was more characters, and it just really lost a bit of its charm. This is the Last Ronin, not the Last Ronin, so maybe it's something that I didn't really expect when I was going into it. Whereas when it was one-on-one, it would really mix it up with the paneling and also where the characters were placed. The focus was more clear and it just flowed better with the pace. More impressive than that was how it could draw focus in the more emotionally charged conversations. In all honesty, some of these were that good that they were more engaging than the fights that were going on, which is really saying something. One thing to note though, and this is specifically about the Deluxe Edition, this does not include all of the variant covers. So I was looking forward to seeing all of them in one place, and you might have been the same, but who knows, maybe IDW has some upcoming collection of just the variants that are all going to be under one hardcover. And yep, I'll probably end up buying it. But if that did get released or you just want to pick up any other Ninja Turtles books, you can get them from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. I feel like I've said this a lot in recent reviews, but this had a phenomenal first issue. The introduction is great, the voice, the setting, the tone, the action, but it still kept the raw emotion of this story at its core. This is a bittersweet story. We're used to seeing the Turtles as a team, except for those moments where Raph goes off on one on his own, which honestly I can relate to. And fair warning, it's pretty much been 2 years since the identity of the Last Ronin was revealed, so I'm not really going to classify that as spoilers. So skip to the final verdict now if you don't even want to know who it is. And yeah, emotion is really at the core of this book, and it lands every time. Even during the opening action scene, you could feel Mikey's anger going into every attack. There was this uncomfortable feeling every time he'd use one of his brother's weapons with the same fluidity that they would. And because of that, I love the story that this wasn't telling me. I could imagine the years of practice that he went through to get that good with each weapon, so it felt great because good action is really easy to do in a Ninja Turtles book. But The Last Ronin felt more like a character study of Michelangelo and also just the 4 brothers as a unit, and he illustrated that by not having them as a team. The scenes where he envisioned his fallen brothers speaking to him really reinforced the point that Mikey still isn't that confident in his own decisions, and he still needs them there even if he's just imagining what they would say. It's clear that Michelangelo knows what he's got to do, but he just still needs that backing of his family. Every time they'd reappear, I'd have this momentary feeling of joy that would quickly evaporate and then I'd just feel worse. But this story does only really work that well if you're already a Turtles fan, and if you're not, I'd definitely recommend checking out my Where to Start TMNT. And maybe I'm wrong in that because I do think I suggested The Last Ronin in that video, but this very much felt like a conclusion chapter to me of something that I started reading years ago. Not because that's when the first issue was released. And regardless of if you're a fan of the 80s series, the 2003 one, or the one that was coming out in the 2010s, the original comics or the IDW series, I feel like this is a nice ending for any of them. Sure, I could nitpick how certain continuity wouldn't add up, but this book's already depressing enough, let's not make our own lives worse. And the reason why I feel like this works from any angle is because of how the world evolved. There is a continuation for certain villains and allies, but not in a way that feels like it was forced to suit the plot. I'm not going to say who makes an appearance here just to avoid some of the spoilers that goes on, but none of the established characters feel like they were just shoehorned in. The city in 2040 was cool too, and it very much felt like what an 80s rendition of a future would be, with this totalitarian regime and youth gangs running the streets. It didn't look too different from worlds that we'd seen in films like The Running Man or Demolition Man, or other films from that era that end with the word man. However, the sewers still had a sense of familiarity. It felt like home and I resonated with Mikey, and I often just wanted him to go back down there and live a bit more of a peaceful life. But I guess that's part of it because it does really feel like a complete story arc for Michelangelo. He is often the one that doesn't take himself too seriously, so this concept might sound like it's one of those that could very easily go into just being gimmicky and edgy for the sake of it, but there is a very different mindset from the character that starts this series and the one that ends it. And it's clear that throughout this he's still carrying that anger and pain and doubt and loss. This book did such a good job at that it made me miss my brothers, and I don't even have any. And the most heartbreaking part about that is that The Last Ronin doesn't shy away from showing how the Turtles lost the battle. And it is drawn out, it is brutal. You don't get all of it in just one prequel issue, you have to go through it in pretty much every single one. It felt like a last stand where you could see the surviving characters getting more and more desperate as it went on. There is betrayal and dumb decisions and red herrings of hope despite what we already know. And having to go back to it so often throughout this series really put us in the mindset of Michelangelo. This must be what it's like every single day for him. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting too invested in this series, but I just felt like it did a lot story-wise with just 5 issues. It's funny as well because a lot of characters have already had this endpoint type of story, but I wouldn't put The Last Ronin in a similar bracket to them because it didn't feel as gimmicky. Everything felt deliberate and that there was a lot of sincerity and that the people working on this just really cared about ending this story. Except the middle part of this book. This miniseries is only 5 issues long, so I am going to be a bit harsher if one issue really doesn't do it for me, but parts of the 3rd one and also the 4th one had me checking how many pages were left. I was worried a little bit too that it was going to just be one of those titles that lost all of its steam and it was just going to have a really good beginning and then just limp its way to the end. I just felt that the focus moved away quite dramatically from Mikey to a character that I just didn't really care about. Sure, yeah, it was cool seeing that he was willing to step into the sensei leader type role, which does does feel like a good arc when you consider where his characters come from, and I thought it was going to lean into this cheesy message that family carries on even after a loss, you know, which is nice, but it's not what I signed up for. The battles also became more about one group attacking another group, but the reason why this book is great is because it's one man, or in this case Turtle, going against the world to avenge his family. Like, look mate, I signed up to be emotionally molested by this book, and the middle just gave me too much of a break from that. Fortunately though, that lull was only temporary, and I do wonder if the delay in issues was because the creators were seeing what people enjoyed and what they didn't, and then they just reshaped the story around that, because it's just too uncanny how great this final issue is. It got rid of the bullshit and the distractions and just remembered what this story was about. I'll speak more in the spoiler section, but the ending to this for me was on a similar emotional level as when I went back and reviewed Why the Last Man, except, you know, with less tears. Okay, enough gushing about this book though, because it's not perfect, and I think the reason why I checked out a little bit in the middle is because of the confusing order of the flashbacks and the futuristic stuff. Like I said, maybe it was because of the fact that they wanted us to go through a day in Michelangelo's mind and constantly relive it, but at the same time it started because there was a conversation that Michelangelo was having, and then they'd just keep appearing, but at points where it didn't feel like it was relevant to the story. And the biggest problem that I had with this book was the villain. TMNT has so many great evil characters, and with this being tied so deep into the core and the origins of this series, I was just hoping for more than what I got. I won't say exactly who it is or who it isn't, even though I do think I spoiled it when I was doing the introduction. Damn, I need to get better with that. But it doesn't feel like they were treated with the same sincerity or raw emotion as Mikey. If he of all characters is allowed to develop and mature, then why does the villain still need to be this caricature? Don't get me wrong, they're still formidable and put up a good fight, but their identity just didn't mean that much to me. And if it wasn't for the history, I just wouldn't have cared at all. And worse than that, it gave you this sense that there was going to be somebody else that was going to come in, but that just also kind of went nowhere. I'm probably going to end up ruining this book for someone if I speak about it anymore, so I'm just going to jump into the spoiler section. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict. But the villain of this story is Oroku Hiroto, which is a name that I'm probably butchering, and he's also the grandson of Shredder. But they kind of introduce him as this stereotypical angsty teenager who's just living off the success of his family, and they even have Karai in this kind of stasis chamber, and I thought that that was going to mean that maybe she was going to come back later, but it doesn't really pan out at all. But I just didn't feel that massive threat from Oroku, because even though he did have this army and he ruled the city, it was only really because of his family. And don't get me wrong, I do like that they kept the family war aspects, and because of the fact that the Turtles are clearly Splinter's sons, it's like they've got that sins of the father type storyline going on. We didn't feel like an earned reputation, so I was just a bit disappointed that he was the only villain throughout this. And with how serious this book was from an emotional perspective, I just wanted more depth from him if he was going to be the villain. But that scene in the mid part where he's monologuing over the city was just cringeworthy, which is saying something coming from me. Credit where it's due though, he brought it in the final fight. I was a little bit worried in the middle part that Mikey was just going to team up with Casey and a few others and lead this new kind of team, but I'm glad that they just brought this back to being about Mikey's last stand alone. The fight itself was great as well. I laughed a bit at the fact that Oroku was pretty much a T-1000, but it's something that I also found pretty cool. Again, it's in the future, so it's kind of like Mikey is using the knowledge and wisdom that's been passed down from generations, whereas Oroku's just using the latest technology. And I loved how this started at the highest highs of the city, but they kept fighting all the way to the bottom to the sewers, which is his home and it's where his last stand should take place. And I can't say that I'm surprised that Mikey died, but it still hit me quite a bit. And it's because that's why he wanted in issue 1. He even tried to kill himself, but he knew that he hadn't accomplished his mission. But in all honesty, I thought he would have lost the voices of his brothers a lot earlier on in this book, and I think that that might have actually improved the story. Give him a full issue to be completely isolated, and it would have meant even more because more time would have passed when he joined them in the afterlife. And I'm not saying that this ruined anything, I just think it could have been improved if they went that way. But yeah, I absolutely love this scene. I'm not sure if it was a flashback or it was actually the afterlife, but I'd like to believe that it's the latter. He accomplished his mission and he can go back to just being a brother and hanging out with his family. Splinter's there, Casey is as well, and I think because of the fact that I can't remember seeing April in this final scene, that it must be the afterlife. And I didn't mention April before because I wasn't sure if that would count as heavy spoilers, but she was great in this. I loved that her and Mikey were pretty much the last thing that each other had to remind them of the good old days, but I was annoyed by her daughter Casey. Sure, yeah, she was useful in the first issue, so I'll give her a free pass on that one, but then it felt like she was going to become the main character of this. Now don't get me wrong, I like seeing Mikey pass down the knowledge of his father, but again, don't give me hope that he's going to survive and this is going to be a happy ending. That's not what I signed up for. However, one thing that I can't disagree with, but I was still hurt by, was Raph dying first. Sure, as soon as he went after Karai, I knew it was game over. And he's so hot-headed that it makes sense that he would be the first one to go, but a part of me just always hoped that the Last Ronin was gonna be Raph. Mostly because he's my favourite, yeah, I can't deny that. Narratively, Michelangelo was the only logical choice to be the Last Ronin. I don't think this story would have been as good if it was any of the other turtles. But I think that's why Raph's death hurt the most, because of the fact as well that it seems like they're just never gonna find his body. The underwater battle was cool, I loved that, it was one of the clear highlights of this series. But with each page, I knew at some point I was gonna have to watch my favourite turtle die. And as well, it was that realisation for me that this was pretty much the chain reaction that caused everybody else to die. This is my final verdict. And how do you end a story like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? That's a question that apparently came up after the answer had already been figured out, and I think that's the reason why The Last Ronin works so well. This kept its core strong, and remembered that the reason why we love this franchise is because at its heart, it's about family. If you take that away, you just get the bleak outlook that we've got in these 5 issues. Do I think that this is the exact same story that Eastman and Laird thought up in the 80s? No, and from an art perspective, I would have been really interested to see what this would have looked like if it came out in the 80s, but I just loved how this was a short story that didn't get bogged down in the continuity that had been added in the 4 decades since the Turtles first appeared. It just focused on the Turtles, and impressively so by putting the spotlight on just one of them. I don't think this is a book that will have the same impact if you're not already a fan of the Turtles, and yeah, the art doesn't always stick the landing for me. There is also a bit of a lull in the middle, and the villain is kind of a letdown, but something about The Last Ronin just feels so unique, and even in a comic landscape that's already had titles such as Batman: The Last Night on Earth, Wonder Woman: Dead Earth, and Old Man Logan, and probably a handful of others that I've already forgotten, but this was TMNT's take on ending a character's journey. And because this was so raw and full of passion, it's the reason why I think this is such a pivotal moment in the Turtles' history. It was so fun getting swept up in the hype and the mystery around this series when it was first announced, and I might be biased, but there's still a lot to enjoy in this book even though the hype has died out. It's not perfect, but I do think it's great, and it completely lives up to the expectations that I had for this title, and it is a must read for any fan of the Ninja Turtles. And because of that, I'm going to give it a very strong score of 80%. Woof woof! So that's the review, hopefully you enjoyed it, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs! Woof woof! See you at the next video.